Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. Very excited for today's guest. He is a very talented man who wears many hats, Frank Rich. We will be talking with Frank in just a second. But first, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. Frank Rich is a journalist, author, and television producer. He's a writer at large for New York Magazine, and he was previously chief drama critic and an OpEd columnist for the New York Times. He executive produced the long-running HBO series Succession and Veep, as well as the limited series White House Plumbers, and the documentaries Six by Sondheim and Becoming Mike Nichols. His books include The Greatest Story Ever Sold, The Decline and Fall of Truth from 9/11 to Katrina, and the memoir Ghostlight. He has been awarded 6 Emmys, 3 Peabody Awards, 3 Golden Globe Awards, and a Producers Guild Award. His journalism honors include the George Polk Award for Commentary and the Goldsmith Career Award for Excellence in Journalism from Harvard University. He has twice been a Pulitzer Prize finalist. In 2015, he was inducted into the Theater Hall of Fame. His new limited series for HBO, The Regime, starring Kate Winslet and directed by Stephen Frears, is scheduled to premiere in March 2024. Frank, welcome into the back room.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you.
I'm a big fan. Been wanting to have you on for a long time, so this is a big thrill and an honor to have you here.
Well, thank you. Really, it's very nice of you. I'm happy to meet you face to face.
You wear a lot of hats, and I want to talk about all those hats with you today. Want to peel the onion back a little bit, take you back to childhood.
Sure.
I know you grew up in D.C., and one of the things we love to talk about with our guests is to see how much connective tissue there is to what people were interested in as a child to where they eventually landed in their careers. Like for me, when I was like 9 years old, I used to hang around the Nixon campaign headquarters. I'm a total liberal in my adult life, but I just liked the buttons and the bumper stickers. So I would take them and hand them out in the neighborhood. I became a politics junkie. Maybe that's where it started. So tell me about you. Theater, film, politics, TV, any of that in your childhood, interest-wise?
All of it. I mean, there's a pretty direct correlation in my case. I've thought about it a lot. I wrote a book about it, a childhood memoir at one point. So I grew up in D.C. I was not from a political family, but I lived in the city. It's a company town, so politics are all around me. I remember being taken by my mother at when I was 7. I didn't quite know what it meant to distribute Adlai Stevenson buttons in the in our neighborhood, and of course, journalism was also all around me. Although the Washington papers are fairly provincialist. Washington Post, for instance, before Watergate, I was out of Washington, out of high school by the time Ben Bradley remade that paper into a world-class paper as opposed to the sleepy paper was then. So, and then as far as the theater goes, maybe still is my greatest passion. As a child of divorce, I think it's not uncommon that, some of that, particularly in those days when almost no one got divorced. I mean, I never heard the word divorce until my parents got divorced, and none of my friends had divorced parents until they graduated high school, and everyone's parents got divorced then. And so I found a sort of refuge in the theater, and I think that's part of it. The first show I was taken to see was the touring company of the Broadway production of Damn Yankees. I was a diehard child Washington Senators fan when they before they left and became the Twins. And it was the ultimate sort of wet dream to have the Senators steal the pennant from the Yankees. That was, but I don't know if that's really what glommed me on the theater so much as just as it captured my imagination. So, and I'd say the other thing that affected my worldview in Washington was someone who lived in the city, not the suburbs, who went to public schools, not private schools. I was very, very conscious that there were two Washingtons, that there was the Washington that was a backlot for tourists to come and tour the way they would, the Hollywood studios at Disneyland, see the beautiful, federal buildings and tour the White House and the Capitol. And then there was a Washington of the actual city that was very poor, largely a majority Black city, a terrible, when I was in high school, it was declared by the Washington, D.C. public school system was declared by the National Education Association the worst in the country. It had partially because in those days, this D.C. didn't even have the sort of half home rule it has now. There was no mayor. It was they called the House District Committee, largely populated by white, Southern, then Democratic, racist congressmen who wanted to starve a school system that was 90% public school system, 90% Black. So I was very conscious that what you see on stage, what you see when you tour the White House, Lincoln Memorial, is different from what you see backstage where, when I was growing up, there were poor people living in alleys. There was tremendous poverty blocks away from the White House. And it was the year after I graduated high school that the city exploded after the King assassination in 1968, sort of showing to the world there were two different cities there that I had grown up with and been keenly aware of. So that, I think, shaped my politics. It fit with my idea of theater, that there's what's on stage and what's going on in the wings. And all of that sort of, and I always was surrounded by journalism. I delivered the Evening Star, a paper route to make extra money. And, some of the people I was delivering to was like, I didn't know them, but like Tom Wicker, Walter Lippmann, the lions of the journalism world of that time, who lived, in my neighborhood, more or less, in Cleveland Park and Washington.
And with regard to theater, you've had a very close relationship over the years with Stephen Sondheim, but I believe at around 10 is when you first had an exposure to his music.
Well, yes. I mean, I should say about my relationship with Steve, I met him because he reached out to me about something I'd written when I was still in college. But then after that, I didn't know him until after I'd long ceased being a drama critic. If I had known him when I became drama critic, I never could have written about it. But I knew him. So I met him like I was 20 or 21, and then I got to know him again. But, I was in love with Broadway musicals, and they would try out in those days. Broadway shows would try out in cities like Washington, Philadelphia, Boston, and New Haven. Doesn't really happen now. No one can afford to do it. And so one of the shows that tried out when I was a kid was A Funny Thing Happened Way the Forum, which was his first produced musical as a composer lyricist on Broadway. Got terrible reviews in Washington, almost died there. I saw it, loved it, became a fan for life. And of course, when I moved to New York for 2 weeks later, for more discerning audiences, it became a hit. I met him because years later, a decade later, I was reviewing plays as well as writing editorials of my bifurcated life about the Vietnam War for the Harvard Crimson. And my senior year, I reviewed a show of his. It was, again, a tryout, Peabody tryout in Boston called Follies, that I loved. It got pretty much trashed by Boston critics. And I think because I was one person who liked it, and somehow he saw my review. There's a student paper usually circulate among adults, particularly outside of campus, but someone seen it and shown it to him. He asked to meet me, and I met him, and he gave me a lot of encouragement. We had a drink, and we had a correspondence for a year or two after that, and really was the first person to say to me from the real world to validate, maybe I had something to offer as a writer. But it'd be another 10 years before I even became a drama critic. I was a film critic and TV critic and a political journalist before that.
So somebody had given him the review of Follies, and when he reached out to you, he said something to you like, since you're one day going to become the enemy, I think we should meet. It was something like that.
Yes, something like that exactly. And we met, and we had a drink in Boston before he left town. And I guess to some extent I did become the enemy. I didn't like everything of his that I reviewed when I was the Times critic for 11 years in the 1980s. But then we got past it 20 years after that and became friends.
It was a very generous move on his part for someone of his stature to reach out to a college student to make an introduction like that. I mean, I doubt that kind of thing happens all the time.
I have to say, I'm sure it doesn't. And I also have to say, as I would learn when I got to know Steve much later in life, this was a routine practice of his, not necessarily to critics or reviewers or journalists, but to a performer that he saw and liked at an off-Broadway show, or a composer of a song that he heard at a workshop. And when he died, now more than 2 years ago, a lot of people came out of the woodwork of all ages and generations, and it became sort of a thing, I think, on Instagram, of letters and encouragement they received from Steve Sondheim at crucial moments in their career. And it was a lesson that, I took seriously, because when I, in my mature career, I try to always see, if I can, or at least talk to or write to, young people who reach out to me who want to do some version of what I've done. I think it's important to do that, and sometimes it gives encouragement, when you're needy and you need that. And I'll never forget what he did for me. And by the way, he was replaying the lesson taught to him as a child when, as a kid, his mother socially knew the great lyricist Oscar Hammerstein. And Hammerstein, beginning when Steve was like, an adolescent, gave him encouragement that would obviously pay off later in one of the greatest careers in the history of American theater.
And what a storied career it was. I mean, you're talking West Side Story, Gypsy, the shows you mentioned, Follies, Forum. You've said, quote, "What's forgotten that now that Steve is a grand old man of the theater is just how hostile critics and audiences were to his work for much of his career." Why was that?
It's fascinating. I don't really know, but here I have several theories. One is he never did the same thing twice. And a lot of people who were commercially successful in the musical theater, this probably applies to other avenues of show business, including, movies and television. A lot of people who were most commercially successful found a niche and kept to it. So someone like Jerry Herman, who wrote Hello, Dolly and Mame, or Andrew Lloyd Webber, who wrote, Jesus Christ Superstar, and Joseph the Mason Technicolor, Dream Go to a series of spectacles. They sort of did a version of the same thing. Whereas Steve, one show was set in ancient Rome in a comedy. One was a bittersweet romance set in Scandinavia, a little night music. Company about a single man in contemporary New York. Pacific Overtures about Commodore Perry opening up Japan to the West. There couldn't have been more varied, material and shows, but also and varied music to go with it. It wasn't the same. Rodgers and Hammerstein, they were great in my view, and in Steve's view as well. But there was a format. There's not a long distance between The King and I and The Sound of Music, thematically, or what they do. So he was never content to do the same thing over and over again. And his music is daring, tricky. It's music better than I do. Anyone who plays piano or sings can tell you how hard it is to execute, and it takes developing a taste for, an ear for, but over time, the audience caught up with him. So shows like Follies, Company, Sweeney Todd were all ahead of their time. Sunday in the Park with George, most of them lost money and failed on Broadway. They usually lost the Tony Awards shows that are forgotten now, and it shows something about how art can work if there's something authentic and true about it. it's built for the ages, and eventually people are likely to discover it. Whereas things that are more pandering, you know, are evanescent. They don't last forever.
Mm. There's something else that you had said about him and his work, which I think is really interesting in the context of this conversation. You said, quote, among the many things I've learned from Steve is that a career as iconoclastic as his, whatever the profession, requires not just talent, but courage. He not only had to outlast the most hostile naysayers, but to ignore powerful trends in pop culture. So from a timing perspective, is it also possible that his music, you say he was ahead of his time, but was it also that he never capitalized on the current trends to tap into the zeitgeisty kind of thing of the era?
I would say that's less a factor because that was true of everybody. It was true of all his rivals too. Basically, and I say this as a child of the '60s and came of age with the coming of age of modern rock music and pop music. The Broadway musical theater completely missed the boat. At a time when they could have, and Steve often talked about this, they could have recruited Paul Simon or Laura Nyro or Bob Dylan or to write, or the Beatles, whatever, to James Brown's, people like that to do shows. They didn't, and so and Steve at least was more aware of it. But Company was a relatively modern score by Broadway standards at that time. A typical other show then would be a show like a musical like The Rothschilds, which was sort of a follow-up to Fiddler on the Roof by the same author. But he never, and his music now still doesn't fit any kind of pop music, really. When he wants to parody pop music, he can and did. He did some of that in Company, and he did some of it in Assassins, of all things, giving John Hinckley a sort of '70s pop ballad. But no, his music had its own voice, and that's why it didn't cater to the Rodgers and Hammerstein and Cole Porter musical culture that he grew up in in his early years, and it didn't cater to rock really. He was keenly aware of rock, but basically he wasn't going to try to pretend to be something he wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
He admired the Beatles, he admired a lot of rock music, but it wasn't what he did.
Mm-hmm. I read that when he was in his 40s, his mother sent him a note saying that the only regret she had in her life was having him as a son.
Yeah, that she wished he'd never been born. Yes, and in fact, he talked about it publicly, and in a documentary, 6 by Sondheim, that I did during his lifetime about him for HBO, we included a clip of that moment. She may have said like on 60 Minutes or someplace, I can't remember anymore. And he had a very, very troubled, he was also a child of divorce. He was close to his father. His father remarried. His mother was obviously not a nice, not nurturing and not encouraging. And
not nurturing. You're being kind.
Yeah, being kind. Was obviously a horror.
Right.
But he survived it.
Mm-hmm.
And had something of a sense of humor about it. A lot of people wouldn't have. And and so, yeah.
And so you landed at the New York Times, and you spent 14 years there as the chief drama critic, and 17 years as a columnist. Did I get my numbers right?
Yeah, almost. I joined as a drama critic in 1980. I left that job at the end of '92, so it was about 11 and a half years. And then in one form or another, I was a columnist until I left in 2011. So how long was I was there? A little over 30 years.
Right.
Okay. The two jobs.
I've always been fascinated by reviews and reviewing. Like when you decide to go see a movie or a play, do you personally put much weight into reviews when you make decisions on what to see?
When I was growing up, I read reviews, particularly of the theater, because I wanted to see what I was missing. I was in Washington, D.C., in this sort of middle class background. I wasn't going to Broadway all the time or opening nights. I wasn't going to London. To me, the best critics conveyed the feeling of what it was like to be in a theater when a live event was happening and what it felt like. And to me, the opinions were secondary. I mean, the two critics that I revered the most as a kid, Walter Kerr, then wrote for the New York Herald Tribune, and Kenneth Tynan, who wrote in London and to the New Yorker. In retrospect, most of their opinions, a lot of them I didn't agree with. I mean, Walter Kerr, who I later life got to know and succeeded, was a hero of mine, never liked much of Sondheim's work. Kenneth Tynan didn't understand Beckett or Pinter, as I recall, but it didn't matter if they were really great writers. And in movie criticism, another critic that had a huge effect on me was Pauline Kael, the movie critic for The New Yorker, who was a brilliant writer about movies, and sometimes my tastes were aligned with hers, but she didn't like Kubrick and she didn't like Hitchcock, two of my favorite directors.
Right.
So as a reader of criticism, I want terrific writing that's informed and knowledgeable and it brings the event alive, particularly if it's something I'm not going to see or can't see. And then usually I can find my own way to what I want to see as a consumer of culture. The test of a great critic is that they can write so well and excitingly about something they've seen that they make you want to go even if they hated it.
Right.
Pauline Kael could write a pan of a movie, and just by how she described it and brought it alive, you said, I'm going to see that tomorrow. And then you might find out, oh, she's right. It is terrible, but maybe you'd like it. That kind of criticism is vanishing, unfortunately, because in the world of quick takes, hot takes, the internet, social media, that kind of essay that really is beautifully written and has an excitement about it, they're still done in some publications, obviously, but it's a vanishing genre and a vanishing craft, and much less influential than it once was.
And do you import all of that when you were writing reviews? Like, was your goal to bring the production, colorize it, make people feel it and get the flavor, versus trying to influence what their ultimate decision was going to be, whether to see it or not?
Those aren't mutually exclusive things. The opinion was always the easy part. You could take 100 people who saw a show, and if they all had the same, we'll say for the sake of argument, they all had the opinion. But one who should be a professional critic is he or she that can convey, as you were saying, the color of an event, the feeling of it, the emotions, possibly the intellectual headiness, the entertainment, and then it speaks for itself. When I occasionally would teach criticism at college students, an assignment I always gave was write a review of whatever you're writing a review of, and don't use any adjectives and ideally no adverbs either. If you can describe it well enough and what you felt, your enthusiasm or your detestation, as the case may be, will come through, because it'll come through in the story, not through you saying, this is a show you've got to see, or this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. I don't think smart readers are persuaded by that kind of rhetoric anyway. It's suspicious. People who write that way don't interest me as a reader of criticism, and the best ones don't. So that's my philosophy. Does that make sense?
Sure, absolutely. I think when you, as a reviewer, if you see something that you really don't like, I would imagine it's very hard not to be genuine with your opinions, and people are free to listen to them or not,
Right. But, the opinion comes from from your description and what you're writing, not necessarily because you say this is a stinker, and also humor is a very useful tool in dealing with things that are not great, because you might as well have some fun. But, I wrote pans and shows on Broadway where I never even mentioned the actors. I didn't feel they were responsible for being in a show like Moose Murders, to take an example, a legendary flop that I ran one night that I had to review. And the influence of critics anyway, then and now, is wildly overstated. And many of the things I liked the most were flops. I wrote the most favorable reviews of Sunday in the Park with George, was a flop. Almost all of August Wilson's plays, a playwright I championed over like 6 or 7 of his works, all of them failed on Broadway except the one that had a star, James Earl Jones, in it. So it's all overrated anyway. But and if people want to see Cats or whatever, they're going to see it regardless of the critics.
So you
that's always been the case.
Of the film The Passion of the Christ, you wrote nothing so much as a porn movie replete with slow-mo climaxes and pounding music for the money shots. That might actually get some people to go see it.
Well, maybe, but that, just to get the context right, I wasn't reviewing it as a critic. I was writing a column to illustrate Mel Gibson's virulent anti-Semitism, which is percolated through that movie.
Yeah,
I hadn't been a movie critic for years when I wrote that. It was really about the message that that to me was a big hit. It was an enormous hit. I don't think what I wrote had anything to do with it. I don't think, frankly, there's an audience that really reads the New York Times op-ed page at that time. But it was an enormous hit, and I think it probably was already a hit when I wrote about it, since I wasn't reviewing it. But my point was, here's someone using a mass medium for bigotry. That's different from panning a movie because it's boring or poorly made or badly acted or badly written. It was in some ways, it was quite an effective movie, in the same way, The Triumph of the Will is an effective movie, even as it, pushed the ideals of the Third Reich.
I know a lot of actors, and actors always like to say that they don't read reviews. I never read reviews of my stuff.
Since I've been working with actors for the past 15 years in television, I'd say it's interesting. I'm not sure I know. There's some actors who definitely say that. There's some who clearly read the reviews while pretending that they're not. But frankly, if I were an actor, I wouldn't necessarily read my reviews, because, in particularly favorable reviews, it's kind of an old some truism in the theater, that if someone gives a great performance in the theater and gets a great review, and a critic like me singles out, oh my God, what Meryl Streep did in this one scene on stage, you're going to become self-conscious and suddenly start distorting what you did, because, that's a great thing I did. So it's going to make, so I wouldn't blame actors for a second for not reading it. And indeed, as a producer, I'm very careful about, not being specific in praise when I'm talking to an actor while we're making something. I just finished over a number of months making a project with the actor Kate Winslet abroad, and I can say I'm not objective because I produce it, but I think she's giving a brilliant performance. But it's a very specific performance where she does things she's never done before that make it tick. And so, well, the extent that I, speak to her and encourage her, I would never say, and by the way, I love the way you convey this emotion to this actor in that scene. It would screw everything up. You don't want to do that. You want an artist to have the space to succeed or fail on his or her own, without, you don't want to hear, if you're an actor, you don't want to hear other voices, pro or con, making specific comments about what you're doing while you're doing it.
Yeah, I totally get and agree that it would be totally fine for actors not to read them. But I also, in a way, totally get why they would, why not? I wonder, can you put so much of your life into a piece of work and then not listen to the people who are saying, hey, we watched it and here's what we thought?
Yeah, but I also feel actors have different techniques. And there are famous actors who are not necessarily so introspective and can probably read a review pro or con and have it roll off their back. And there are others who they're like sensitive musical instruments. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, because both kinds of actors can be quite effective, but who can be thrown off. It's like, I don't know, if you're watching a symphony orchestra and someone in the third row is popping bubble gum, it might throw you off. That might throw a musician off. I think that criticism of things like scripts are somewhat different. I mean, certainly there was a tradition in the theater that of playwrights, producers, directors out of town, if there's a critic they respected and the show was still in work because they were still developing it on their way to Broadway, they would listen, and sometimes they wouldn't. I mean, Sondheim and his director and producer, Harold Prince, did not listen to the pans they got out of town to Company and Follies and Forum on the way into town. That takes a lot of guts. But other playwrights will tell you, gee, this critic in the Boston Globe, was right. What was this scene doing in the second act? Let's cut it. And they take it out. And if it worked better, they'd keep the change. If it didn't work better, they put it back in again. When I was a kid and teenager in Washington, I hung around this one Broadway tryout house, the National Theater near the White House, so much I was hired as a ticket taker. And one thing I saw was watching. The shows were still in work. They were usually going to play 3 weeks in Washington and then a week later open on Broadway. And I saw shows that ultimately were enormous hits that in Washington were immediately recognizable as hits. And yet I saw the standing in the back as a lowly ticket taker. The creators of the show keep I could go every night, play hooky from homework in high school and see, a classic example is The Odd Couple. It was clear the moment it opened in Washington, it was going to be an enormous success. And yet, during 3 weeks in Washington, you could see Neil Simon, who wrote it, and Mike Nichols, who directed it, and Walter Matthau and Art Carney, who starred in it, constantly making changes. And they didn't even come up with the show's ending until the last weekend in Washington. And 4 days later, opened on 45th Street, New York, and became this enormous hit. But that they knew it could be better, even though it was already successful, was a revelation to me. And they listened to critics to some extent, I'm sure, but they also listened to themselves. They knew they had a vision, and they wanted to make it right. By contrast, the first Sondheim show that I saw, Finding Amway, the Forum in Washington, its tryout, got terrible reviews. I was there as a 12-year-old, 11-year-old. The audiences hated it. They walked out. It was empty houses, and they stuck to their guns. They never made major changes in that show, and they took it into New York and triumphed. Washington just didn't get it. They just didn't understand it.
So after the Times, I think about a dozen years ago, you went to New York Magazine, also writing about politics and media. And I'm really interested, I want to ask you about politics in a second, but I'm really interested in how the media has changed since you first started writing about it.
Oh, I would say, yeah, and it's like what Moore's principle, it's changing more every 2 or 3 years. Look, I grew up in a 3 television network world, major movie studios. It's only by the time I was writing about media at the Times and then at New York, it already changed substantially. Obviously, cable news had come in, which didn't obviously exist earlier. Many newspapers and magazines had folded. And by the time early on, not that early, but within a few years of my becoming a columnist in the 90s, the internet came in and the web as a form of distribution. So the upheaval was just enormous. And now, of course, phenomena as various as TikTok and AI are completely reshaping it again. And you question whether words mean the same thing as a form of communication as opposed to videos. You look at a network like CNN, which was revolutionary 30 years ago, now trying to figure out what to do when their constituency gets news from their phones and probably aren't going to watch a full bit of CNN programming on their phone while bopping around their lives. And I think there's a lot of chaos and confusion, and I'm very glad I'm not writing about it anymore because I'm as baffled as anyone else. But when I first arrived I was at Time magazine before I was at the Times, and you typed into typewriters, it was taken to someone to put it into a word processor. You handed it in. Yeah. When I got to the Times, there were still printing presses in the basement. The presses started rolling, at 10 o'clock at night. You'd hear it. There was ink dust everywhere. You wrote into something that looked like a word processor, but you had to be there to file your copy. There was a front page like newsroom. There was no such thing as a personal computer yet. And then when modems came in, that was considered revolutionary, and then ultimately the Times physical footprint within first its old home and then the new one it built on 8th Avenue got smaller and smaller because no one was coming in. There's nothing to do with, COVID. It's pre-COVID and was, exacerbated further. So it became a completely different kind of culture. And that doesn't mean that it's necessarily worse. I mean, in some ways, a paper like the Times is in many ways, people who romanticize the old Times, I'd say go look back at the Times in the 1970s and 80s. Is it really better, or let alone earlier? I'm not sure. Really, reporting was much less ambitious. Muckraking wasn't as built into the practice of journalism as it is now. Investigative stuff. They didn't have the manpower then to do it. So it's changed. One has to hope it can last and continue to exist even in the world of TikTok and AI. And it's fascinating to me that places like the Times are now starting AI units to try to figure out what to do about it, or do with it. It's also an enormous issue in television where I do a lot of work these days. So
yeah, I think a lot of the criticism over the last few years of the Times has been in their choice of headlines and how they treat very controversial stories. It's like the whole period that we went through where the press couldn't call Trump a liar. He was spewing mistruths and all that. And so you'd see a headline that almost normalizes certain behavior. And that still kind of happens. Not just at the Times. I think it's everywhere, but
it's everywhere. I don't disagree with that criticism. But it's always thus. I mean, it's always, these institutions are always flawed. So when I was writing a column and writing suspiciously in the run up to the Iraq War, at which I eventually wrote a book, it was the Times was one of the prime perpetrators of the WMD myth. A specific reporter, Judith Miller, was repeatedly played on the front page by Times editors, writing these very dubious and, in fact, false stories about Saddam's supposed nuclear arsenal. And before I was born, the Times missed the Holocaust as a story. And famously, years later, they finally apologized for it. Halfway through the war, the first story they ran about the camps, the concentration camps, was buried next to a mattress at the bottom of a page, halfway through the section. When I was a drama critic, and people were literally before my eyes on that beat, dying of AIDS, the Times was incredibly slow to cover it or take it seriously as a disease. Indeed, when I was a drama critic in the 80s until the late 80s, you weren't even allowed to use the word gay in a review. You had to always say homosexual. So these flaws will continue. The Times missed Watergate, yet it's probably still the best paper in the country for all these flaws, and others have, their own issues of things they missed, their scandals.
Well,
the
and it's
Washington
still,
Post.
it's still the newspaper record of the world. And when you talk about the internet, to me, the consequence of the internet is truth, fact checking, reality, because the race to get the news out, I think, creates a lot of collateral damage with truth.
But I agree. But now there's a whole other and even more. Look, people like you and me and many of your listeners, I'm sure, will go to a trusted source, whether it be the Times or
Washington
the
Post.
Guardian or CNN or whatever it is, the Washington Post, to say, wait, what's really going on here? Let's go to places likely to get it mostly right, despite all the flaws we've just discussed. But now you have a situation where AI can basically take Times material themselves and then through the technology, not even intentionally falsify it or change the context of it. So if, to take a broad, slightly hypothetical, not that hypothetical example, you could type into an AI search engine the question, what really happened yesterday in Gaza, let's just say, and at this incident. And they may give you an answer that includes several paragraphs of the Times that might be attributed to the Times, but mixed in with stuff that might be wholly false, might be deliberately planted misinformation, might be propaganda from one side or the other. And the person who doesn't have the time to seek out the Times or the inclination or doesn't want to pay for the Times or the Post or whatever source you want is going to see that on the run, and the Times will become sort of an unintentional beard against its own wishes for false information, fake news, fake photographs, fake videos, everything else. I don't mean to sound alarmist, but I think it is kind of alarming. And
No,
I
it's
think
terrifying.
everybody knows it, but no one knows what to do about it.
Well, it has to be regulated, and there has to be a process whereby the owners of information are in that process, so that these AI technologies can't just take from wherever and not pay the content owners.
I completely agree with you, but how that actually happens, who will enforce it?
Sure.
Do we have a government with the will and, frankly, the intelligence, I mean in the sense of IQ intelligence, not intel, to actually do it when they don't really understand it themselves? Obviously there'll be a couple of senators and a couple of members of the House who are up on these issues, but then let's face it.
Chuck Grassley ain't one of them.
Chuck Grassley ain't one of them. And by the way, either is Bob Menendez. We can name many others. And some people don't want them or afraid of the big tech companies. And then, how is the far right going to weaponize AI, and how are hostile governments? And what's fascinating to me is the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the major media only discovered AI was a big story really in the past, 6 months to a year? Suddenly it dawned on them. Just as it dawned on Hollywood right ahead of the strike, but just in the past year, but this has been going on. It's late in the game. AI is not something in embryo. It's something that's highly advanced, much more advanced than what you see if you subscribe to ChatGPT. That's like the training wheels version. The real version is much more effective.
So let's talk about the current chapter of your life, television and film. You've been involved in some great productions, Veep, White House Plumbers, Succession. What is your process for deciding what to get involved with?
It's all about writing. And, the first series I produced was Veep. And I was pointedly looking for someone who could write a contemporary Washington satire, my hometown. And to do that, you read people, you watch their work, and then try to convince them to do it. and then try to convince not employed by HBO, a producer with a deal there. So I have no power to say, let's do this. I have to go to the creative executives of the network and say, here's the case for this. And, many of the things that you pitch to them are rejected, far more rejected than accepted. And then for me, the whole process has been working with writers I've come to know. For instance, Jesse Armstrong, who created Succession, wrote an episode in the first of Veep's 7 seasons, and that's where we met. And we spent a couple of years developing a whole other drama that didn't get on, but right before Succession. This show I just did that Kate Winslet in a limited series called The Regime. The writer on it was a young writer on Succession. I met in it was a writer that we hired on Succession. We had a staff of, I don't know, like a dozen writers, and he came up with that idea. The idea, which is it's briefly put, it's about a dictator in a present day fictional Middle European country whose government is seemingly about to topple, and with Winslet as the dictator. And it's a clever, in my view, otherwise if I didn't feel this way, I wouldn't be doing it. Very clever, incisive snapshot of politics as they stand right now, not just in Middle Europe where it's set. And HBO, wanted to do it, but there are other things I'm just as enthusiastic for that don't happen. But that's basically, there are other kinds of producers who maybe start with, oh, I've got this big star who wants to do something,
right,
and find something to match the star. I always, because I'm a writer myself, not a television writer, always start with writing.
Always,
that's something that I care about.
It's always about the writing.
Yeah.
What do you think is the secret sauce of Succession? Because it's going to go down in history as one of the greatest series ever. And it's just so damn good. But what makes it so damn good?
Well, it's very generous of you to say that. And it was always, time will tell. I think it's extremely, look, at the base, it's extremely well acted and written. And again, it begins with the writing. And by the way, a number of not just Jesse, but there are at least 3 other writers on the show who worked on Veep. One thing about writing is, I've always felt, long before I was in television, it's much harder to write comedy than drama. Much, much harder. Even though comedy is taken less seriously by critics and possibly the world than tragedy or drama, I feel that on Succession, it's not some secret sauce as you had. Not all of them, but most of the writers were comedy writers, brilliant comedy writers, and to have them writing a drama, you sort of get the best of both worlds. And indeed, the first season of Succession, a lot of people didn't like it. It got a very mediocre review in the Times and a bad review in the Washington Post, and the two most common criticisms were, is it a comedy or drama? I can't tell. And who wants to watch a show with such horrible people as the central characters, which they are. They're horrible people. But the fact is that writing is true. It captures the humor and the drama. You find yourself sucked in even to characters that are awful. They're selfish, they're nasty, they're destroying a lot in the public space of America and the Western world.
But they're also vulnerable. They're vulnerable characters. And that starts to allow you to find them likable at the same time, in some way.
I agree. And I think an entryway is humor. I think if you find yourself, the characters are often quite witty, and I mean intentionally witty. I mean, we had, there is a character like Cousin Greg, who's not witty. He's just, farcical and ridiculous, kind of like the way Jonah was in Veep. But you have characters that are savage but funny. Logan is funny. Roman, Kieran
Roman.
Culkin's character,
One of the funniest characters ever.
And I think if you laugh with them,
Mm-hmm.
that sucks you into identifying with sometimes their heartbreak or their anguish. And that's the way I think humanity works. And so that's a very hard thing to do. It takes us really good writing, and there are certainly other people who can do it and do it extremely well. Jesse had that gift, and the writers we had that gift, and also all of us, including the people in charge of us that we answered to at HBO, really insisted on very high standards. I mean, these scripts went through dozens of drafts. They were not written on the fly. A decision about how to end the series, when and what that ending would be, that was 2 years of discussion and writing when we started discussing at the beginning of the third season, even though the show didn't end until the end of the fourth season. And so, but you see, here's an example of a show I had nothing to do with. Mike White's A White Lotus. I think I've long felt he was a fantastic writer. He did a little notice series with Laura Dern about 10 years ago on HBO that I recommend people called Enlightened. That's just a fantastic show that only ran 2 seasons. In White Lotus, they're different from the characters in Succession, but they're also rich characters, not as rich, really venal, really crude, really out to get each other, even kill each other, and which is something we didn't have in Succession. And yet they're incredibly funny, and you find yourself caught up with them at some emotional level. The Jennifer Coolidge character over 2 seasons of White Lotus, there's a reason why people love it, but she's not an admirable character, but it's a great performance, it's great writing that it has full human dimensions.
Well, the thing, am a huge fan of the show. I was so sad when it was over. I felt like I lost a friend. But the thing for me was not that it was great writing, which it was, but the writing had this cadence and rhythm to it. It was very like an opera in a way. The rapidity with which the lines were punched out, it was so quick. I've never met anyone in my life who talked like these people, because I think normal humans don't talk that way. But you watch a show to get lost, right? It's not reality.
Yeah.
Just the way the lines were delivered, it was literally like watching an opera or some like a ballet, something otherworldly than just TV actors reciting TV show lines.
Well, I think that's wonderful of you to say, and you could be a critic, because I feel you capture. There's something stylized about the writing. I mean, sure, some people do talk about this real life, but most don't. And you're exactly right. You enter a world it's not journalism. It's make-believe. You enter a world that's created by artists, I feel, and then you enjoy that. It conveys, and it hits you emotionally and intellectually in a way it wouldn't if you had the same characters talking an ordinary speech that wasn't particularly funny or anything of the kind. And the density of the writing, it's a little bit Sondheim-esque. One of the things about Sondheim as a lyricist, and to some extent, as a composer, it's dense. The word, like, takes Sweeney Todd. It's about a mass murderer. It's about a serial killer. But there's something almost Shakespearean about his songs, or poetic in that show. And here, in the case of the Roy family, they're not serial killers, but they're certainly out only for their own power and money, and don't give a damn about the world, that they're poisoning with their media products. And yet there is a slightly poetic quality about it, not in a poetic, flowery way. Just, as you said, there's a diction, there's a cadence, and a wit. Their lines they all have, basically, all of them. Jerry, Tom Wantgans, Roman, Kendall, Logan, they all have a kind of wit. Look, Iago had a wit in Othello. That's and it works. if it's done well, it works. And we're very lucky to have in Succession a group of British writers, British and American, men and women, that got together in the room every day and just kept, it's just fascinating thing to watch and be a part of.
How much, if at all, was the Trump family a factor in shaping any of these characters? Because there are similarities, but there are also huge differences. But there's enough to make you go, oh, I think I kind of feel like I know these people.
It was absolutely never on the table or discussed. And by the way, we had a similar thing happen in Veep, where we created this character, Jonah, who this idiot who ends up running for national office and starts as an aide, and is an anti-vaxxer who kills his own stepfather, and has all that's a lot of stuff is sort of MAGA stuff and Trump stuff. All that was, to our horror, it was all in the can, and then suddenly Trump started doing it as if he had seen it and was taking it as a playbook. In the case of Succession, there's a lot of reading in the room of biographies of titans in the media, not just Murdoch, but Michael Eisner, Robert Maxwell, Sumner Redstone, anything like and others too. We just were voracious readers of all that, and then just all stirred into a pot. Trump was never in it. I mean, first of all, it was not an impressive media mogul the way these people were, but Trump wasn't even on our radar screen. By complete happenstance, the pilot, HBO Jesse wrote a pilot script. HBO decided to make it, and we cast it, and we were about to start shooting it, and we had a table read at Silvercup Studio in Queens, Long Island City, before shooting the pilot. That morning, it was the morning of Election Day 2016. And so we all sitting around at the cast are meeting each other for the first time. We do the table read. Then everyone adjourns. So, everyone would say, I'll see you at the Hillary victory party, whatever tonight, and so then a week later, we start shooting it. And we're shooting some of the earliest scenes. I'm staying there with Jesse, with Adam McKay, the director who did the pilot, watching a scene with the siblings. And suddenly Adam McKay says, wait a minute. And if the Trump boy, sometimes Shiv, it's just,
yeah, no, it's there. The two idiot sons.
But it was not premeditated at all. It's like it was written months before his campaign got serious and thought he'd be president. It had been written months earlier because we had to cast the bill, the sets,
Sure.
So the election wasn't until like 6 months after the script was finished, and no one saw this coming. And so we took that in, and some people ultimately would write about that, but we never leaned into it. We never looked to the Trump family consideration. First of all, they're just too banal. I think our family is more interesting than Trump's.
And smarter, way smarter.
And God knows smarter, and they actually ran a successful business, not one that.
And they have some real human emotions, actually, unlike the Trumps.
It's true. I don't think the worst character morally or ethically in Succession is not remotely is still, I think, well above Trump.
Yeah, it was maybe even midway through the series where I just was like, whoa, I see some similarities here. So I didn't see that right up front. It took me a while to say, oh, the two idiot sons, the daughter, the maniac narcissist father, blah, blah, blah.
But can also keep in mind that Jesse, the creator, and I'd say his two deputies, the first among equals among the writing staff, are all British. They were not people who spent their life following Trump, hearing about Trump.
Right.
None of them lived in New York or the United States. It's just like when we had our, 4 seasons later, we had our finale of the whole show, some people thought in Tom becoming Victor that there was a player in the early days of baseball, Major League Baseball, named, wasn't Wamsgant, it was spelled slightly differently, who had done a famous like triple play by himself. That was the inspiration. I'm here to tell you, British writers on Succession do not follow American baseball. Like all they talk about is British football. So it was not, but people just, sometimes you just hit on something by accident.
Mm. So my last question I want to ask you about real quick. You're making a movie about George Santos?
And making a film for HBO that is being written. I mean, it's not, it'll be a while before anyone sees it. Certainly not, it will be this year. And without saying too much about it, it's a film about someone who could successfully defraud the wealthiest congressional district in New York State, one of the wealthiest in the country. Educated, affluent constituents who were bamboozled by a complete fraud. And it's very much set in that world. The writer who's doing it is a young writer named Mike Mikowski, who wrote a previous film that I had nothing to do with, that HBO aired, and actually won an Emmy a few years ago, called Bad Education, which was based on an actual fraud involving principal of a high school in Long Island. In fact, the high school where Mike went, he's from that congressional district. And that sort of captured a certain kind of Long Island milieu. And this is a story that happened there. Could have happened anywhere, but to me, one of the most interesting things about it is that this complete empty guy who lied about everything and no particular talents except for getting publicity and for lying was able to pull it off, sort of blue leading, wealthy, educated district. And what does that say as much about voters right now as it does about Santos? And I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be a very fresh take. I don't want to say too much more, but it's not, it's not a biopic. It's very much, if anyone has seen Bad Education, they'll sort of get the tone of what we hope to do in this film when we get it going.
Well, we'll eagerly look forward to it. We're all about the Santos in the back room here. We've had Mark Chiasano on and Nasa Woomer and
Mark, we optioned his book, and he's a fantastic journalist who covered Santos and a very good writer himself, and so he's part of our merry band in revisiting this very strange American fable. Only unfortunately it wasn't a fable, turned out to be true. But a fabulous in its heart.
Well, good luck with it. Thank you for coming on. You've been very generous with your time. I didn't even get to talk about politics with you, which I really want to do. So maybe you'll come back and we can just talk about politics.
I'm happy to. I don't think I have anything to say that you're not saying without me. But anyway, about it, it makes one's teeth hurt.
Yeah.
I much prefer working in make-believe, I'll tell you. But really lovely to talk to you. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Bye-bye. Take care, Frank. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.